morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 142 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. I have got my usual co-host, Carlo Parcelli, coming from Washington, D.C., and I have our special guest, Max Parry from Baltimore, Maryland. He has recently completed an article published at, I'm going to butcher it now. Is it Covert Action Mag?
Correct.
Oh, good. I got that. I got that right. Covert Action Mag. So, very detailed, lengthy article. Tremendous journalism. Lots of content. Published on like April 24th, but really talking about how the United States has used Islamic terrorism, to further its imperial agenda around the world. The thumbnail that I used for our program today, shows Uncle Sam carrying an ISIS effigy over into Syria and then leveling the place and then picking the ISIS effigy up and leaving.
Yeah, I know that meme.
And that about sums up, how the United States, Western imperialism uses terrorism, as a weapon. But Max really gets into the specifics, and it's really a great article. So I've linked to the article in the comments section of this video, and I've also linked to a great discussion that Max had with Jeremy Kuzmarov and Gloria. What's Gloria's last name? Gloria Guillot. And they're like the editors, right, of the Covert Action Mag?
Jeremy is. Gloria is on the board there, and she is also a journalist and activist. But no, Jeremy's the managing editor of Covert Action Magazine. And they had me on their show, which is live streamed, and then I guess it's also syndicated on WBAI in New York, which is like a progressive radio station that has everything from Democracy Now! To like Jimmy Dore, and syndicates a bunch of different shows. So I think I was on WBAI at like 6 a.m. I looked on the schedule for it, talking about Chechen separatist terrorism. So if anybody was up and had their radio on, I guess I was there too. But yeah, no, they had me on and we had a great discussion about the article. Yeah.
So, I don't even know how or where to begin, but, there's a lot of common misconceptions, and depending on what demographic we're talking about, there's a lot. Like if we talk about common misconceptions on the left or common misconceptions from, conservatives on the right, like there's just so much ignorance, and I don't even know which ignorant demographic to address first. Any thoughts?
Well, I think I know what you're referring to. There are a lot of common misperceptions, and this sort of thing does become very politicized. But like I was saying in my interview yesterday, I think that there's a pretty common misperception, like these days anyway, like I think a lot of people have become aware in the last 10 years or so, since the Libyan conflict and then also the Syrian conflict. Especially in recent months, where you had Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation hearing as Director of National Intelligence. And, there was a big firestorm around it because she was being accused basically by some of the Democratic politicians that didn't want to approve her appointment, as being a Russian asset and conspiracy theorist and all that. And because, she had made allegations that the U.S. was supporting Al-Qaeda affiliated elements in Syria, which have just now taken power. And she pointed to several facts, not only the WikiLeaks email, the Hillary Clinton email that was released of, Jake Sullivan, who was the national security advisor to Joe Biden at the time, who was vice president. in an email exchange with her, saying AQ is on our side in Syria. And she also brought up the fact that the CIA had supported Islamist groups as part of the Timber Sycamore program, which was a very expensive covert operation, very, very expensive one, arming, the Syrian opposition, a large section of which consisted of radical Islamist groups. And so she cited all this, and I think the public has become aware of how the CIA and the U.S. have supported these kind of groups for their foreign policy goals. And I think people are also aware of sort of the general history of how Al Qaeda came to be, with the support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in Operation Cyclone back in the 80s. But I think in general, people seem to have this impression that between the 80s and these more recent conflicts, that there was somehow like a breakdown or a gap in their relationship with one another, as far as Al Qaeda and Islamist groups being used as a strategic asset, because the U.S. was at least ostensibly pursuing bin Laden. And in my article, I try and talk about how that's basically totally false, because in several theaters of conflict, both in the Balkans and in the Caucasus, the U.S. was supporting parts of bin Laden's network and Islamic extremist groups, even as at the same time it was supposedly pursuing him, because the official story given is that during the Gulf War, when the U.S. basically set up Saddam Hussein and that whole Iraqi incursion into Kuwait, there's some people who say that actually I believe that Kuwait is really rightfully Iraqi territory and that Kuwait is like a fake country. But anyway, during that conflict, it was said, it said that bin Laden had offered to Saudi Arabia, because the U.S. had built this anti-Saddam coalition, basically, of Arab countries in the region. And bin Laden had offered to his Mujahideen fighters, his foreign fighters, his whole network. And Saudi Arabia had turned him down, and the U.S. put troops in Iraq. And reportedly, bin Laden was upset about that, and then was also upset about the presence of U.S. troops in the Holy Land in Saudi Arabia. And eventually he was kicked out of Saudi Arabia, and I believe he went to Sudan, and then eventually ended up in Afghanistan. And then, of course, declared this so-called holy war on the U.S., and the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed, the USS Cole in 2000, and then eventually 9/11 happened. But during that whole time that the U.S. is supposedly pursuing him, some of his network, he had people in Bosnia, the Bosnian Mujahideen, that the U.S. was supplying arms to, actually, apparently through even a country as unlikely as Iran, because, a lot of these battlefields get very complicated, where you have like a country like Israel supporting Serbia, and then Iran supporting the Bosnian Mujahideen, and the Bosnians are, so you had Iran and Al Qaeda on the same side. It's bizarre, but somehow this is how these alliances form. But he also had the KLA in Kosovo, the Kosovo Liberation Army. They were on the U.S. list of terrorist organizations, or the State Department's list, and they were deregistered. And the U.S. started backing them against Serbia, and they had connections to Al Qaeda. They were ethnic Albanian separatists, very much tied to organized crime. And now, actually, the leader of the KLA at the time, and the first prime minister of Kosovo, the protectorate they ended up forming, using stolen Serbian land, Hashim Thaci, he's now actually finally indicted for war crimes, and he'd been previously tied to things like human organ trafficking, and this is a state that erected like statues of the Clintons and whatnot, Bill Clinton in Kosovo. But they had connections to Bin Laden's network, and then also at the same time, they were supporting Al Qaeda elements in the Caucasus and Chechnya, and that conflict went on. I mean, it became especially dominated by just but breaking.
Yeah, I wonder if I'm breaking up or if you're breaking up.
I don't know. It says both. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. But basically, my point is that there's a common misperception, I think, these days that in the intervening period between the Syrian and Libyan conflicts and Operation Cyclone in the 80s, that somehow there was a breakdown in relations between Bin Laden and Al Qaeda and U.S. support for them, and it's really not the case at all. Even as the U.S. was supposedly pursuing him, they were being used as a strategic asset and were getting covert support. And people can deduce whatever they want from that. I mean, I always thought it was ridiculous that Bin Laden, would be able to do these televised interviews and media appearances, where they put the reporter, whether it's Peter Bergen of CNN or whoever it was at the time, with a blindfold, and they drive them in a car to Tora Bora, wherever he is, and then they're able to do this recorded interview, but somehow the CIA cannot locate him. I mean, I always just found that incredibly ridiculous. And it's clear that whatever conspiracies people want to come up with, there's also the whole thing. I remember Seymour Hersh had an article when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001. I believe he called it the airlift of evil, because after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan after 9/11, the Al Qaeda leadership that had taken refuge in the mountains in Afghanistan, and a lot of the leadership of the Taliban as well, were like very suspiciously practically allowed to get away on, I guess, Pakistani military planes. And, the U.S., had multiple opportunities to, take them into custody there. And then Hersh did a great book later on, like disputing the whole official story about the Bin Laden, the SEAL team raid, and how it was supposedly, they had found him, and when in fact the Pakistanis knew, and basically the U.S. knew exactly where he was for years, and he was, they could have apprehended him much earlier. I mean, the whole thing is fishy. But regardless, whether or not they were even legitimately pursuing him or not is a whole separate question. The point is, regardless, Al Qaeda elements were still being supported both in the Balkans and very much in Chechnya. And I talk about there were some recent revelations too. Actually, I don't know if you guys saw, CBS 60 Minutes actually did a segment last Sunday, talking about the Saudi role in 9/11 and these lawsuits brought by the families. And of course, it's things that alternative media has been reporting on for decades, that these mainstream journalists are just now getting to, let alone all the Israeli connections to 9/11. But the Saudi stuff, I mean, these lawsuits that the families have brought, they did this whole segment where, there was a tape, basically two of the 9/11 hijackers, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, who were supposedly on American Airlines Flight 77, which crashed into the Pentagon. They had fought in Bosnia. The CBS segment didn't even mention that. I mean, it was just ridiculous. But they had fought in Bosnia with the Bosnian Mujahideen. So it's so ironic, the Bosnian Mujahideen are being supported by the United States and then they fly a plane supposedly into the Pentagon a couple years later. But they didn't think it to mention that. Anyway, but they had basically they had made their way into the United States. There was a report in the gray zone, actually, that they were supposedly CIA assets. The CBS left that out as well. But nevertheless, they were in the United States, and they were actually in my hometown in San Diego, supposedly, and they didn't speak English very well at all, and they, immersed themselves in American society, but with the help of a Saudi intelligence officer, a known Saudi intelligence officer named Omar El Bayoumi. And Mr. Bayoumi, hooked them up with an apartment, and they're taking flying lessons, and he's basically facilitating their whole stay in the United States. Apparently, they weren't even paying rent. I think he was covering their rent too. And also, I mean, this is the other incredible thing that CBS left out, that the guy that they were, the person that they were renting from was also like a prolific FBI informant. So you have two CIA assets who are members of Al Qaeda being helped by a Saudi agent to rent an apartment from an FBI informant. And then somehow they couldn't coordinate and prevent 9/11. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But basically in this CBS report, they show how 2 weeks after 9/11, the Saudi agent who was living in England at the time, he was arrested by Scotland Yard, I guess. And in his home, they found a video of him basically casing out the U.S. Capitol building, recording everything, and I guess like writing down. They found like mathematical equations that were, I guess, could have been, deduced that he was trying to, come up with a plan for flying, for landing, help with the landing of the plane, or the crashing of it rather. This was in the possession of the FBI, this video, but like tons of FBI officials supposedly did not know about even the existence of the video, that someone at the top had clearly, they didn't make that suggestion, but it's very obvious that someone at the top did not want multiple people who were key to the whole investigation to even know. It's very clear, basically, in the CBS 60 Minutes report, that, the Saudis were very much intimately involved in the whole 9/11 debacle. And they're just now getting to this stuff that's been painfully obvious to anyone with a room temperature IQ who follows alternative media for the last 20 years. I mean, and there, it barely even scratches the surface of all the different various theories that people have about 9/11, and whether it was the involvement of who, and, I'm sure people in the comments are going to be spouting off whatever their individual theories are. I've written about 9/11 in the past, actually. But anyway, so, there's a misperception, long story short, about, I think that, that people need to be more aware of both the Chechen conflict and the Balkan conflict, as far as like it's the missing link in that whole timeline, because there was never any interruption in the relationship between Islamist groups and the U.S. government, even as the supposed war on terror was being fought, and so the Chechen conflict, my article is really about the Chechen conflict, because it relates to how the U.S. Here's another misperception, that, that the U.S. and Russia that the geopolitical tensions between Washington and Moscow only began, after Putin started pushing back against the NATO expansion, when actually, in hindsight, it began much, much earlier. And I don't think it's a coincidence that For example, a lot of the think tanks and the NGOs that were providing clandestine support to the Chechen separatists were formed exactly at the moment that Vladimir Putin took the reins from Boris Yeltsin. I really don't think that that's a coincidence in hindsight. I mean, for example, the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya was formed in 1999, just as, this relatively political unknown ingratiated himself in Yeltsin's circle and went from being appointed from FSB director to prime minister to then being, after Yeltsin's resignation in December of 99, becoming, winning the presidency the next year. And I don't think that that's a coincidence, because I think that they had very strong reservations about him from the very beginning as to whether he was going to be a puppet, U.S. puppet.
Yeah.
And actually, in my article, I try and dispute this is the biggest misconception across even alternative media. You will see people endorse the theory that Putin ascended to the presidency through the apartment bombings that happened in 99. I've even seen people who I really respect just parroting that claim about him. And there have been other articles written about Chechnya, but I don't think anybody's really gotten into that claim as much as I did. At least I couldn't find it. And it took a lot of research, but that's another thing, big misconception is that it's a total myth that the FSB and Putin had anything to do with those apartment bombings.
Yeah.
And, I found an interview with Ibn al-Khattab, who was, bin Laden's official representative in Chechnya that week, saying that they were going to bomb Russian cities.
Yeah.
That's aside from the fact that the whole reason for the Second Chechen War, which Putin was very much involved with, had already started a month earlier. There was no need for a false flag. It's just ridiculous. There are some questions surrounding the bombings, because the whole reason for that conspiracy theory or whatever is that there were these suspicious FSB drills that were done. Like, I watched the documentary that Andrei Nekrasov made, and they had no evidence. The only evidence was that the FSB did these drills that were done after the initial series of bombings. And those kinds of drills are not unlike what anti-terrorism drills in this country happen regularly to test the vigilance. I mean, if you have a bunch of bombings go on in your capital, they did these drills that one of them, they were busted with a fake bomb. It didn't go off. It was fake. And it was to test the vigilance of the public, whether they were reporting stuff. They do this all the time. I mean, I hate to even bring up my personal life, but I work security, and one of my coworkers was telling me about some of the crazy active shooter drills they do now, where they actually have people shoot blanks and stuff. I mean, just terrifying stuff that would give me a panic attack. I hope they don't do that at my job, but this was, yes, I understand why it was suspicious at the time, and there were, the Russian public had a lot of questions about these bombings, because the bombings were of apartment complexes where mostly lower income people lived. They weren't of targets, they didn't target important people or government buildings or anything, but they had done all kinds of various, incidents, there was a incident that I talk about in the article where they had taken a bunch of people hostage in a hospital in the mid-90s in Stavropol, and Yeltsin had negotiated with them for, the release of the hostages by withdrawing from Chechnya. In other words, he gave them everything they wanted. And as they were leaving the hospital and when they were given safe passage, they took the cesium, the radioactive cesium, which is used to treat people with cancer. They took a bunch of it from the hospital, and then months later, they mailed out, or they planted a cesium in underneath in various parks in Moscow, and then alerted the media to them. And the media went there and dug them up. And then Shamil Basayev, the leader of the Chechen separatists, issued threats to use dirty bombs. I mean, these people had the capabilities, like the idea that they would not bomb apartment bombings or not bomb apartments is just laughable. I mean, these people took, in Moscow, just a couple years later, they took 900 people hostage in a, and these accusations, I mean, the people you will see making them, you see Marco Rubio, John McCain, all these fucking warmongers. And yet these are the same people that if you suggest that there was anything fishy about 9/11, they won't even, it's the clearest case of imperial projection I've ever seen. This whole thing about Putin with the apartment bombings. I even see this woman on Twitter, what's her name? Red Kahina. I mean, Molly Klein or whatever her name is, repeating this claim to all of her followers. I mean, it's just total BS. So
I've had a run-in with Molly Klein before. She's no fun.
She is a Fed. If she's watching, you're a Fed. Fed Kahina.
She's involved with what's his name at that Counterpunch. I think she's involved with the Counterpunch people that are kind of Draitser. Anyway.
Oh yeah, he's horrible too.
Yeah, they're awful. Yeah, Nekrasov, we actually interviewed him, and I was really surprised that he was still a real liberal, and he was not gonna. It's like he had liberal donors that he really didn't want to offend, and so I kept trying to get him to, since you exposed the whole Browder hoax, you got to have some sympathy for Russia's perspective now, right? And he did not.
That's disappointing because I really liked the Magnitsky Act behind the scenes. That was a brilliant movie because it got into this whole meta narrative, because you could see it was like he realizes that Browder has been duping him about the death of Magnitsky, and he starts to have this whole epiphany where he's like, "Oh my God, maybe I've been duped this whole time."
Well, and he leverages his access as a good liberal anti-Russian to engage Browder and to ask him, and so that was a great documentary, but you would think that he wouldn't just still be such a, I don't know, I hate to call him a sellout, but I think
it's actually the opposite. I think he's come around. I don't know if he's ever going to be able to have that crossing the Rubicon type moment. You would think in hindsight that he would think about, that's what I say in my article, that I wonder if he's reconsidered his whole thesis, because that's how he kind of made his name. He made this documentary called Disbelief, which people can go out and watch. If you think that, don't take my word for it. But if you look into the claims, it's total, there's no evidence at all. I understand why there's a lot of questions around those bombings, and that there did need to be more transparency, and maybe there was some degree of FSB involvement. I've seen some people say that if the FSB didn't do the bombings, maybe they allowed them to happen on purpose, or that it was possibly like a specific faction within the FSB that did it or allowed or facilitated it somehow. Who knows? Maybe it's possible. But there was clearly an effort to make it about Putin, because Putin had gone from FSB director to prime minister. The way that he conducted the second Chechen war was totally different than the way that Yeltsin conducted the first one, which was just indiscriminate bombing. It was totally haphazard. It resulted in total humiliating defeat because it was conducted, the Yeltsin government was so corrupt and so incompetent. And you know, actually, it's funny. Uh, doing research. I kind of I have a theory now because I was researching a lot about Putin's very rapid ascendancy to power. Um, and I think I realized how Christopher Steele came up with the whole P tape thing, in the Steele dossier. For those who don't know, during the 2016 election, the Clinton campaign cited this dossier that was turned out to be totally fabricated, that was put together by this MI6 agent they hired, Christopher Steele, where he alleged that like Russia has dirt on Trump and that it's supposedly a a tape of Trump like in a hotel with Russian prostitutes and even like engaging in water sports, I guess. And I think where he's getting that from is that supposedly the story about how Putin inserted himself into Yeltsin's inner circle or gained his trust was that in the late 90s, Yeltsin was notoriously corrupt. And there was, I guess, a prosecutor that was specially appointed to investigate his corruption and a lot of his misdeeds. And Putin at the time was FSB director. And apparently the story is that the FSB was surveilling this prosecutor and acquired and got recorded video of this prosecutor with multiple prostitutes. And then Putin sent the video of the prosecutor with prostitutes to Russian media, and they broadcast it on TV. And then this prosecutor was instantly discredited. And then the pending case that was in the works to take down Yeltsin was dropped. And then Yeltsin became understandably very fond of Mr. Putin. And then that sort of explains the way he very quickly moved from that he maneuvered himself into that inner circle. And so that's why I think the idea that Putin could like see into the future, like 15, 16 years, that Trump was like going to run for president and like supposedly has tapes in the past of like he was surveilling Trump or something. Obviously that's complete total bullshit. I mean, I don't know when Steele claims this supposed fictitious tape was made.
Yeah.
I don't know what era he's talking about, whether it's recent years or not. But nevertheless, I think that's where the whole thing about Putin recording people's sexual exploits for blackmail.
No, that's interesting. It was definitely after Obama visited Moscow, because allegedly Trump used the same bed that Obama had slept in to have his golden shower party. And that actually sounds legit, right? That sounds like something.
Yeah, well, definitely Trump is motivated by a lot of, they say the whole reason he ran for president was Obama. I mean, it is one of the most biggest public humiliations I've ever seen. I mean, that video of Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner where Obama is like skewering him for, being a reality TV star, and simultaneously like having the gall to like question his birth, where he was born. I actually have a very different interpretation of that video. I mean, I think it's more like one member of the ruling class telling another, like, you are not one of us. Like, you're an embarrassment to us. Because, Trump is nouveau riche. But anyway, yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions, and that's exactly what I tried to get into in my article, is a lot of in addition to the history about U.S. support for Islamism, like a lot of the common myths associated with that whole war and Putin. And I think that from the very beginning, he was a target of imperialism. I mean, I know there was a period where the relations were supposedly warm. And I remember when I was younger, Putin coming, meeting with Bush, and Bush saying he looked in his eyes and saw his soul and all that. And this bromance, it was like, God, get a room, guys. But it was clearly, I think, bullshit. I think that they didn't trust him from the very beginning, or at least a lot of people didn't. And even while the U.S. and Russia supposedly cooperated, or that Russia went along, for example, in providing intelligence and whatnot when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, there was never really an effort. I talk about this in the article, that right after 9/11, Putin saw an opening and tried to, he was the first world leader supposedly to call Bush after 9/11. And he had actually apparently called him a few days prior to the attacks, after Massoud, the leader of the Northern Alliance, was also killed a few days prior to that. And he sensed that something big was coming down the pipe. But it was very clear that the brief period of cooperation between the U.S. and Russia in this so-called war on terror was very short-lived, and the whole time the U.S. was providing, the CIA was providing covert support to the Chechen separatists, which were very much linked with Al-Qaeda. And I even talk about in my article how, the 9/11 investigation itself revealed those ties, because a few weeks before the attacks, Zacharias Moussaoui, who was the supposed 20th hijacker, he was arrested in Minnesota. And while he was in custody, the FBI field agent, did a background check on him. He was a Moroccan man or is a Moroccan man of French origin, or French citizen. So they got in touch with the French intelligence, doing a background check, and the French authorities got back to the FBI field agent in Minnesota and said, this guy's a terrorist. He's been attending training camps, bin Laden's training camps. He has been recruiting fighters, other Islamic radicals, to go fight in Chechnya for this guy, Ibn al-Khattab. And so the FBI field agent, who had him in custody, wanted to get permission to look in his computer, needed a FISA warrant. And he contacted FBI headquarters, and he sent out a memo to all these leading counterterrorism officials, the outgoing FBI director at the time, Louis Freeh, and they would not grant him a FISA warrant. And also because the CIA interjected and said, we don't consider who this guy's associated with to be terrorists, even though it's part of clearly connections to bin Laden and part of this international network. And they would not grant a FISA warrant to look in the computer. And had they looked in that computer, it's very clear that they would have discovered that the reason he was in the United States and taking fucking flying lessons and not learning how to land, along with all these other guys, was that there were these sleeper cells, and they would have been able to, this is assuming that they did not know that they were in the country to begin with and were allowing all this shit to happen on purpose. They could have prevented they would have been able to identify that he was not the only one in the country, and that these attacks were and then they happened a few weeks later.
You make it sound, Max, like the intelligence community isn't about, defending our country and our people from terrorism. That's how you make it sound. I don't like that. I don't like that, Max.
Well, capitalism's invisible army, I'm sorry to tell you, and burst your bubble. They've been facilitating this kind of stuff for a long time. And there's so many different connections that I tried to lay out in the article. The smoking gun, if people read this and they want to look at a smoking gun, in the article, there's a link to a document that was unearthed, that, it's a court document that shows indisputable proof between the CIA and the Chechen separatists by way of a Bin Laden front company. And there's a link to it in the article. Basically, after the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, which was committed by these Chechen American brothers, it was discovered, in the immediate aftermath of that attack, their uncle, this guy Ruslan Sarny, was, after the bombings, they went and confronted their family members, like, did you see any warning?
Let me interject. So I know poor Carlo is struggling with his oxygen to stay awake. He had a rough night, dealing with health issues. Are you okay, Carlo? Are you able to?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay.
I do have one question.
Yeah, because Max's monologues are putting us both to sleep. So
Sorry.
No.
Let's.
I did not fall asleep. I was curious about the Chechens. The father was hostile to the Russian, very hostile. Yet the son has now turned around and become a hero for the Russians. And what the connection between the two might be with what Max is presenting us here.
We want a short 3-sentence summary of how this came about, where the elder, I forget the guy's name, but the elder, he was definitely opposed to Russia, and now his son is a big ally of Putin. I mean, ostensibly, and obviously the Akhmat forces are really engaged in the special military operation for sure. And I love that our friend of the show, Scott Ritter, had a big speech in front of the entirety of the Chechen military parade. Was pretty cool. But how did that come about? Cliff's Note version.
Well, I mean, it's very complicated, but I mean, first of all, for starters, Ahmad Kadyrov was killed by the Islamists. I mean, he was at a Victory Day parade in 2004 in Dynamo Stadium, which is in the Chechen capital, Grozny, and they put a bomb underneath his seat and blew it up, and he was killed. And yes, it's true. Both the Kadyrovs were at one time part of the Chechen independence movement, but that's when it was a lot more. I mean, the initial leader of the Chechen separatists, Dzhokhar Dudayev, was, he was somebody who had fought in the Russia or in the Soviet military in Afghanistan on the Soviet side, not on the Mujahideen side. And initially, the Chechen independence movement did have a lot more moderates or nationalists in it. But Dudayev's successor, this guy Zalimkin Yandarbayev, he was a pretty hardcore Islamist, and he later went on to be involved in, I believe, the Moscow theater attack and numerous other terrorist incidents. And he was pretty much an Islamist from the beginning. I mean, some of his rhetoric, he skirted the line. I mean, this is what I talk about in the article, that there's the lines between the so-called nationalists and the Islamists was always very thin. And if in the beginning there were some of them where the leadership was more under the nationalists, there were Islamists right there to replace them shortly thereafter. I mean, there's people who defend the Chechens, for example, who claim that Russia, to discredit the movement, like deliberately targeted and killed all the nationalists so that the Islamists would take over, and then they could paint the movement as purely Islamist. Whether that's
sounds
true
like
or not,
something people accuse Israel of doing as well, but
yeah, I mean, it's complex.
Sounds like projection.
Yeah, I mean, it's complex, but I mean, look, very early on, even in the mid 90s, they were doing these kinds of, it's not like the hostage takings just began when the conflict was purely dominated by Islamists, like in the 2000s with the Beslan school attack and the theater attack. In the mid 90s in Stavropol, they took a hospital full of almost 3,000 people hostage. And, that was from the very beginning, the movement was very dominated by Islamists. But it is true, the Kadyrovs, yes, Ahmed Kadyrov was a lot more critical of Putin. And, there's people who say that, like the Islamists and the Chechen independence fighters, they consider them a lot of them consider them sellouts and that they're corrupt but that's the point. I mean, they regardless, the Putin was able to reach a political compromise with the Kadyrovsi, that wing of the insurgency, which was not Islamist. They have elements of Sharia law there under the Kadyrovs, but they're still basically beholden to the Russian constitution. I mean, Kadyrov, Ramzan Kadyrov has, it's become, the place has become a notorious recruitment center for like MMA fighters, and he's set up these, tribal councils where they're able to, where it's not the kind of thing where like these grudge killings and lawlessness is pervasive. It's much more, during the 90s, it was overrun by banditry and the mafia and organized crime and total lawlessness. And now
every family owns a bear, and they all wrestle the bear, and that's how they get good with the MMA.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. Like he's, and that there's that the MMA stuff. I mean, he's a huge star on social media, and all these big MMA fighters come from not just Chechnya, but Dagestan and all the other places in the Caucasus.
So Carlos seems to have frozen. I'm gonna drop him off, and then I'll bring him back.
Poor guy.
Yeah, he's struggling today. It's he's dealing with some health issues, obviously, but if he wants to come back, we will definitely put it back in. So,
I mean, it's complicated. I mean, a lot of people believe that, like the Kadyrovs have just been given power and that it's very corrupt and that they sold out the Chechen independence movement. But I think that they, there were a lot of people that did not approve, fighting for nationalist independence is one thing, but then taking, a school full of 1,100 kids and putting them in a gymnasium rigged with tripwire explosives with bombs hanging off a basketball hoop. And, that's a lot different than, just waging a guerrilla war or insurgency. I mean, there were a lot of people that defected back to the Russian side because the movement had become, whether or not Chechens deserve their own state and nationalists have rights to their own state is a whole other question from then establishing an Islamic state that's clearly a proxy for Western imperialism, because that's what the movement became. I mean, I would question that its legitimacy to begin with, because they never had their own state. And the Chechens, I talk about it in the article at the end, the historical roots of the conflict. I mean, there were these mass deportations that happened in the Second World War, because it's true, there were a lot of Chechens that collaborated with the Nazis and
Stalin just hated people who weren't Russian. Everybody knows that.
I mean, that's the other absurdity. Stalin was from Georgia. He was from the Caucasus. This idea that he could, like they passed this EU or this European Parliament resolution, like saying that the Soviets committed genocide, deporting all these people to Kazakhstan. First of all, they didn't even deport them out of the Soviet Union. They moved them to Kazakhstan, which is where most of the Chechen independence leaders, Basayev, Zakhaev, all of them grew up, basically. It was in Kazakhstan. And then Khrushchev, gradually they were able to make their way back and repatriate. But no, it's true. There was a huge section of Chechens if people want to say that deportations were excessive, sure. But, there were, just like Ukraine, there were large swaths of the population that sided with Nazi Germany. And, there was collective punishment. But nevertheless, the violence did not start until after, Gorbachev came to power and, basically allowed the West to start whipping up, nationalist fervor. And, as the Soviet Union was falling apart, that's when, these nationalists seized the opportunity and started waging this insurgency. And, you had this drunken buffoon at the head of the Russian state. But, yes, the elder Kadyrov was a lot more critical of Putin, but he was killed by his own people. I haven't seen anybody claim that the Russians were involved in that assassination. I mean, it was, and Rams and Kadyrov, they are allowed to have a degree of sovereignty there. They are allowed to have, an Islamic-based society, but it's not an Islamic state. It's not overrun by lawlessness and organized crime. And yes, there's a lot of shady stuff that goes on down there. I mean, disappearances and, there's a lot of corruption and I mean, Kadyrov is a warlord. There's no doubt about it. I'm sure that there's tons of human rights violations going on there. But compared to the 90s, I mean, give me a break. That place was overrun. I mean, human rights groups wouldn't even go in there because it was so, it was so bad. I mean, the part 2 of my article is about, mainly focuses on this so-called humanitarian aid specialist who was really a CIA agent, who was the first person brave enough to go in there. And he was supporting the Chechens. I believe he was smuggling weapons inside humanitarian aid to them. And that's when the Western support to them started. His name was Fred Cuny. And most of the second part of this article is going to focus on him. And he was working with the Soros Foundation, who dispatched him there. And he ends up getting whacked by the separatists, even though he was supporting them, because they were using nuclear blackmail at the time. Dzhokhar Dudayev, who was the leader at the time, this is in 1995. One of the reasons that the Russians didn't go in with an all-out assault in the beginning was because it was long rumored that because there was a Soviet military installation there, supposedly after the USSR dissolved, all the nukes in the near abroad, like Ukraine and Kazakhstan, all those nukes were supposedly returned to Russia after the USSR dissolved. But there was because the collapse of the Soviet Union was so chaotic, there was widespread belief that some nukes there were loose nukes. And there was rumors that the Chechens were in possession of at least a few of them. Huh. And they also had a facility in this town in Chechnya, the name of which I forget. So basically there was nuclear blackmail going on where the Chechens were like spreading these rumors. It turned out to be false, I believe, that they had nukes. And that's the only reason that the Russians didn't go in there all out like they did later under Putin, was because there was a fear that they would use a nuclear weapon. And actually the U.S. was even not clear whether they actually had nukes or not. And that's another reason people believe they sent this CIA agent who was really his official cover was that he was a humanitarian aid specialist. People can look him up. His name is Fred Cuny.
And he didn't make it.
No. Well, the rumor is that he discovered that they were bluffing and that
Oh.
the Chechens did not want that to get out and the Russians to find out, so they whacked him. Even though he was a big supporter of them and had like taken out op-eds. I mean, he worked for the Soros Foundation, which was already starting to demonize Russia at the time. Yeah, he had taken out op-eds criticizing the Russian bombing campaign. And this is when Yeltsin was in power. So the U.S. was, at least on the surface, backing Russia and Chechnya. And so, yeah, stay tuned for part 2. But basically, by the second Chechen war, the U.S. was, the CIA was totally supporting the movement as it became totally Islamist. And that's when people like the Kadyrovs jumped ship and went back to the Russian side.
Gloria succinctly summed up, how the Western imperialist propaganda apparatus, determines if a given group is a freedom fighter or a terrorist, right? So if you're getting CIA support because the government isn't a lackey of Western imperialism, isn't a vassal, and doesn't do what it's told to do, then you're going to be a freedom fighter, and the government that's demanding its own sovereignty and refusing to be, a compliant vassal of Western corporation, the Western interests, then of course, the government's called authoritarian. There's a million ways that they put pressure on the government. All of a sudden, there's going to be terrorists doing bombings, and all these groups are going to spring up saying, hey, we're for the liberation of this, we're for the liberation of that. And it could be, religious based. So the religious based is one of the favorite go-tos of Western imperialism ever since, the British actually were creating Wahhabism. I want to say, Lawrence of Arabia times, after World War I, the Wahhabism started becoming useful. And then especially after socialism, like you guys were saying in the discussion, in the Middle East, Nasser was the big threat. Secular Arab nationalism of a socialistic nature that wanted to, demand sovereignty, have an Arab coalition that wasn't exploited by the West, and that had sovereignty, controlled its own resources. That was the biggest threat. And so Wahhabism and of course the state of Israel have been really good at keeping that from happening. But yeah, no, terrorism as a weapon of imperialism, it's just, the history is it's so obvious that this is what's going on, and yet
well, and it's taken many forms.
Yeah,
you have the incubation of fascism, fascist terrorism, Operation Gladio, or the support for Ukrainian nationalism and all that. And actually, speaking of Operation Gladio, I mentioned the sort of loose connection to the Chechen separatists because there's a very courageous whistleblower who actually retweeted my article and gave it her endorsement. Her name is Sibel Edmonds, and she's a 9/11 whistleblower. But I'd mentioned her in my article because she talks about in her work about the connection between basically she was a whistleblower after 9/11. She worked for the FBI. She's Turkish American, I believe, Turkish and Iranian, but she speaks multiple languages, and she was hired after 9/11 by the FBI to translate. They were in dire need of translators, basically, after 9/11, and she was hired. She worked for them for I think like about half a year before she was fired because she started reporting all the misconduct at the bureau, various forms of misconduct, whether it was like being told to deliberately slow down their work because they wanted a higher budget so they could act like they were overloaded with work and have Congress pass a big budget for them, She also reported the fact that the Turkish government and Turkish intelligence had really infiltrated the FBI and also had, all kinds of assets within the U.S. government. And, she tried to report that and she was silenced. And she also reported stuff about FBI foreknowledge of 9/11, like had they translated certain documents, they would have known, and that there was a possible cover-up going on. And so she became known right after 9/11 because there was this big, I think it was Condoleezza Rice. She gave a press conference where she said I don't think anybody could have anticipated. We couldn't have anticipated that they were going to fly planes into buildings. And she was there at one of the hearings, and some of the 9/11 families were like, well, this woman's been saying the opposite. And then the press interviewed her, and she, basically made statements correcting that statement by Condoleezza Rice. And then Condoleezza Rice actually had to issue a correction saying, no, I couldn't anticipate. Yes, all these agencies did have advanced knowledge or forewarning anyway. So she was a big 9/11 whistleblower. And then she was going to testify at, I believe, the 9/11 commission or something like that. And the John Ashcroft and the Department of Justice basically gagged her under the state secrets privilege because she was privy to all this stuff that she was listening to and translating. And a lot of people assumed that it had to do with all the 9/11 stuff, but I watched interviews with her, and she claims that the reason that she was gagged was because she had classified information about the recruitment of Islamist fighters through the Gulen movement, Fethullah Gulen. And also there was this whole operation that was like an extension of Operation Gladio, because there was a Turkish branch of Operation Gladio that was called Counter Guerrilla. And a lot of those paramilitary fighters were people from the Grey Wolves, which is like a Turkish fascist organization. And so basically that just continued into the 90s, and a lot of those people were imported and recruited to fight in Chechnya, and then also in Xinjiang and with the Uyghur secessionists there. And what I was going to say earlier before Carlo had his unfortunately had to leave and had his little episode there. The reason Fethullah Gulen was able to stay in the United States until he died last year, actually, was because this guy named Graham Fuller wrote a letter to the FBI on his behalf, vouching for him, because he's wanted in Turkey for supposedly being involved in that coup attempt against Erdogan. But Graham Fuller, if you want to, what I was going to say about smoking gun evidence, in the wake of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings, the Tsarnaev brothers' uncle was interviewed on TV, and people started looking into his background. And it turned out that while he was married to Graham Fuller's daughter, this Turkish-American woman, because I guess Fuller's wife at the time was Turkish. And this guy, Ruslan Sarni, the Tsarnaev brothers' uncle, was married to Fuller's daughter and living in Fuller's home. This is the 90s. And while he was there, he formed a organization called the Congress for Chechen International Organizations, which did transactions sending all kinds of stuff, mine-resistant blast boots, like Kevlar boots, X-ray machines, military hardware, cash, all kinds of stuff. For all we know, arms, because in the same indictment later of the company they were doing this with, there was arms sent to the Bosnian Mujahideen. I don't know about the Chechens, but there probably were. But basically, the Congress for Chechen International Organizations there are documents in the indictment of a bin Laden front company in 2002 called Benevolence International, which was after 9/11 was shut down by the Treasury Department for being a front for Al Qaeda. And
wait, how could an organization with a benevolence in its name be Al Qaeda? That doesn't make any sense, Max.
It was a fake charity. It was a fake humanitarian aid
Like,
organization.
how could the Cleaner Skies Act make the skies less clean? It doesn't even compute. But yeah.
Exactly. So basically, in retrospect, they figured out that this guy, Ruslan Sarni, was doing business with bin Laden's front company while he was living in Graham Fuller's home. And Graham Fuller is a lifelong CIA operative. And then on top of that, it's just unbelievable. Like, and actually I pointed this out in my interview yesterday. I'm very disturbed because this is an organization I really respect, the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity.
Yeah.
I learned that
Graham Fuller joined.
Fuller has joined that organization, and I would be very wary because this guy, I don't know if he's having some kind of epiphany or, I know they have all kinds of people from the intelligence community that who are on the outs, who were at one time on the inside, that want to tell the truth about U.S. foreign policy, and it's a community for those kinds of people, whistleblowers. It's an organization I really respect. But this guy, it's not like he's atoned. And on top of that, as far as I know, there's still warrants for him in Turkey for having, being involved in that coup and the Gulen movement, which is a freaking terrorist organization, no matter what one thinks about Erdogan. Fito, they're supposedly who assassinated the Russian ambassador, Andrei Karlov, in 2016. I don't know if you remember that assassination, where he said, the guy who shot him said, "We die in Aleppo, you die here." So I would,
that was that was a while ago. I remember.
Yeah, Turkey says Gulen was behind that. He's a known CIA asset, and Graham Fuller was how he got secured. I don't know why this guy is. I saw recently, I was looking him up, and he did interviews with the Schiller Institute, and I'm like, do these people know who this guy is? This guy is very sketchy.
And I didn't know the specifics, but I read your article and I was like, oh, that's what Max is talking about. Because I remember you were posting about, lamenting that this guy did join the VIPs.
I was shocked.
I wasn't that familiar with him, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of statements. You quoted him in the article, and it's just pretty.
Yeah, he took out entire op-eds in newspapers talking about how we need to use Islamists to undermine Russia. It worked in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, at the very same moment these articles are being published, there's a guy living in his house who's married to his daughter, using his address, sending covert aid to the Chechen separatists. And then on top of that, there's multiple people involved, in that transaction. This is why it's a smoking gun. This guy named Sheikh Fatih Shoshani is named in it. And you look him up, he is not a moderate fighter. He's a ultra fundamentalist Mujahideen veteran. This stuff never stopped. It went from the 80s into the 90s. It just continued. There was never any interruption. It continued in Chechnya and the Balkans and so on and so forth. And Mr. Fuller was right at the heart of it. So I don't know what's going on with him now, but
the whole war on terror, I kind of perceive it as a placeholder. They were really concerned that the United States was going to demand a peace dividend once the Cold War ended, and so they had to come up with something. And what could they do? Well, they controlled these terrorist networks, so they could I think it's likely that they directed them internally, right? Because they always direct them at other countries to put pressure on those governments. But they could have also just turned them on the United States in 9/11 and of course the World Trade Center bombing before that, just to scare the public and make us demand more money for.
It's a strategy of tension. I mean, it's kind of like with Gladio, and you could say like something like the Boston Marathon bombing at the same time. We're supporting these people abroad, and then some of them come back. I mean, because the older Tsarnaev brother, he had traveled abroad and was like attending seminars put on by like a think tank that was associated with one of Brzezinski's think tanks, the Jamestown Foundation. And then they come back and they're, I believe, used as patsies in this like plot, because, they tried to say that, I mean, supposedly the FSB had alerted the FBI about their travels and that the older brother was like meeting up with terrorists in Dagestan, and then they come back and supposedly do this attack a few years later. But it's clear like they were like patsies because the mother claimed that the FBI had interrogated the older brother before, not after, before those attacks even occurred. So it's possible they were set up. I mean, it's a strategy of tension. You in order to get the public to give up more of its civil liberties and
tax dollars,
rely on the surveillance state and the security state. You have to have these attacks happen on your own soil as well. Yeah. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to have. That's been the whole time that they're supposedly pursuing these people, they're supporting them in other theaters of conflict, whether it's Libya or Syria or the Caucasus or the Balkans. It's very on a surface level. It's very cosmetic. They're not. I mean, how can you be having a budget the size that we have fighting terrorism, and then terrorism is only continuing to increase? It doesn't make any sense.
Thankfully, they might be, moving on to a bigger, new kind of enemy, because it was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was dismantled. They were in a panic. Who's going to be our enemy? They picked Islamic terrorism. But now we're going to move to China. We're going to pivot to Asia, and we're going to have a big enemy that can really justify $1 trillion defense budget. So
well,
I don't know. Are we going to see Chinese terrorism pretty soon? I think we might.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I talk about it in the article how the Uyghur secessionists, I mentioned it, the East Turkestan Islamic Party, it's the same thing there. And actually, China sort of dealing with kind of a boomerang effect, because they had actually supported the Mujahideen in the 80s because of the Sino-Soviet split. The Soviet Union was labeled social imperialist, and China made a lot of terrible foreign policy decisions aligning with the U.S. They supported, what's his name? Pinochet in Chile. They supported the Khmer Rouge. They supported the UNITA in Angola. And then, it led them to support also the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And then it comes back to bite them in the ass, because the Uyghur secessionists, it really whipped up that conflict. I mean, because the Uyghurs have been very susceptible to the spreading, that you were talking about, of Wahhabism which is something that I believe I saw an interview once with Mohammed bin Salman. He was basically admitting that that ideology was deliberately spread by the West, encouraging Saudi Arabia to do it, to undermine the Soviets. But ultimately, it came back to haunt China as well.
Very, very recently, Pakistani general was on record saying the exact same thing, saying that, it was at the behest of the West that the ISI was engaged in all of this proliferation of Islamic terrorism against China, against India.
Well, there was an attack in India recently, right?
I think that the revelation might have been before that, because I think the revelation that this general made this quote, saying that we were doing all this at the best of the U.S. And then, that's a whole other issue.
Even Pakistan, that's kind of come back to haunt them, because they have their own, as I understand, their own branch of the Taliban, the TTP or whatever it's called. And there's a concern for them too, because they have a Pashtun nationalist movement there, and although they don't officially support the Taliban, the Pakistanis have always sort of, like the military always has, and that's a very complicated question too. But it was through the ISI in the 80s that Operation Cyclone delivered all those Stinger missiles and trained all the foreign fighters and all that. But it's like a Pandora's box. They let that out, and it's just it's like Frankenstein, that they created a monster and they've had to live with it. China was involved in that, support for the Mujahideen, though it does seem like they've gotten it. The situation has not gotten too out of control there. You were mentioning the last time I was on that China has had a very effective strategy in dealing with the Uyghur problem.
No, I think they've won that. They've won the hearts and minds of the province, and it's the number one tourist destination for Chinese people. So that's over. The West has given up trying to turn that.
I don't think anyone even believes that stuff anymore about the concentration camps for Uyghurs, and it's just ridiculous. And I remember, I think I saw right around the time those accusations, what's his name, Danny Haifong, went to Xinjiang and was this is a very nice place, where are all, it was just, they made, if you read the Western reports, they make it sound like it's there's a Holocaust going on there, and it's
then they changed it to a cultural genocide. And so I saw one of those people, maybe one of those streamers, Dumbrill. Anyway, somebody that lives in China, speaks English, has a podcast, went over there, was interviewing this person who is employed teaching Uyghur culture. He's employed by the Chinese state to teach Uyghur dance, the Uyghur language, Uyghur culture. And so, Japan.
And they are also, as I understand, exempt from the one-child policy, right? The minority groups there, which is a horrible policy. People say I never criticize China. That's something I adamantly think is a terrible thing. But my understanding is that the minority groups and a lot of the other Muslim groups in China, like the Hui people, they don't have any problems with terrorism historically. It's only been the Uyghurs that they've had this issue with. And they have many Muslim minorities in China, just like Russia.
I want to say they have more mosques in China than any other country in the world, but which would stand to reason, because they do also have almost, more people. They have 20% of the world's population.
Yeah.
But I think, it's the West. The West identified, the Uyghurs specifically and got involved in heavily investing into that separatist movement. And they could do the same with any group anywhere. You bring money and then you take control of it, and you don't even have to have a majority or even a tiny minority. You can have a tiny minority, that you invest and pay, and then you just use their name, and the U.S. does everything, right? They do all the planning, they bring all they do everything themselves, and then they're just using, that group's name as the pretext, really. But they're just really good at it. I mean, and they've done it for decades, and they probably learned it from the British, who did it before that.
Yes.
But it's insidious how terrorism is, the vast majority of global terrorism is directly tied to Western intelligence. I mean, that's just a fucking fact. And like you said, there's many kinds of terrorism. There's the narco terrorists that we have that work for us, destabilizing Central and South America, in the Middle East, and also in Eastern Europe. There's a lot of extremist Muslim terrorists, and then there's also the Nazi terrorists. Any ideology that is destabilizing and extreme, we will work and use to destabilize, the society. And we're really good at doing that. But it's the difference between building a better planet, building a better society, which it's hard work. It takes effort. It takes work. It takes investment. It takes time. Whereas just wrecking shit is fucking easy. And the West is really good at wrecking shit. And so that's the threat. We're threatening big time to wreck the planet, to wreck the global economy, to wreck supply chains. That's what we're threatening, China with. That's what we're threatening Russia with, Iran. So Trump just the other day said, anybody that buys, fuel, energy from Iran will not be able to do business with the United States. So we'll see. I mean, he's tweeted proclamations before in his first presidency. He tweeted that he wanted all Western, U.S. corporations immediately to leave China, and that didn't happen. But he's trying it again. So he tweeted, if you buy Iranian oil, you cannot do any business with the United States. And so we'll see, because China buys 90% of Iranians' oil. So we'll see how that turns out. But I think, we are gearing up towards, a real big change in how the world has operated since 1945. The United States is going to destroy the global order they created. They're going to invite chaos. They're going to, it's going to be destabilizing. The U.S. is going to use all of these groups to further their interests, and to, do what they can to, really, wreck the economy of China, and just causing a lot of problems. Anyway, I mean, it seems clear now. Last show I had Greg, and who else did I have that really thought I was being catastrophizing a little bit, but we'll see. And I give it by 2027. I think by 2027. I mean, and it could be.
I don't know. I mean, part of me is inclined to agree with them, but then I can't help but have second thoughts, because I've seen a lot of people I really trust in terms of economic analysis sort of making the same predictions about Trump's handling of the economy, and the effects of the tariffs and the trade war he's initiated, and more specifically the manner in which it's being conducted. Not even necessarily so much that these are natural consequences from the policies themselves, but it's also the sort of haphazard, incompetent way that they're being implemented, and also very mixed, putting a tariff one day and then the next day removing it, it doesn't seem like there's a very logical plan. Now, supposedly there is, I forget who was telling it. It might have even been you telling me, or no, it was. I saw an interview with Christian Parenti on Jackson Hinkle's stream, actually, where he was talking about who was actually advising Trump on his economic plan as far as the tariffs go, and that there was actually a logic to it. But he was also saying, Christian Parenti was also saying that it's not going to work because the main problem is there's nothing really wrong with tariffs per se, but the problem is in order for them to be effective, you have to also simultaneously have state planning and Trump could, for example, issue executive orders to divert funds into opening up factories and there being some kind of state planning. It's not enough to just punish companies for leaving. And, no one's against, I'm not against bringing manufacturing jobs back. I know there was all those hilarious memes about, these AI generated videos of, fat McDonald's eating Americans. They're not going to do these.
Are there sewing machines?
Yeah, sewing machines. But in theory, Bernie Sanders talked about terrorists when he ran for president. It could theoretically work. But if you don't also have state planning, it's not going to really work. As far as Apple coming back and manufacturing phones or whatever it is. There has to be also a certain level of centralization and so that's basically what Christian Parenti was arguing when he was on Jackson Hinkle's show. But he did also underscore that there was, Trump is actually listening. I don't know their names, but that he was actually, there was something of a doctrine that he was trying to follow in what he's doing, but it's very it's not going to work. And I don't think you're necessarily catastrophizing when I see people like Richard Wolff and Michael Hudson and Christian Parenti and all these people I trust also making the same sorts of predictions that he's going to run the economy into the ground, and it's just going to exacerbate the inflation and a lot of, that it's the consumer and the public that's going to suffer the immediate effects of these.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like he's trying to negotiate trade deals with all the other countries, but I'm pretty sure as part of this trade deal is you trade with us and you don't trade with China. And so he's trying to get, an anti-China alliance. And I think, we're just going to see a slow escalation over the next, several months and working up into 2027. But I can't imagine Trump's going to leave office before something big happens, such as an embargo of China, like a literal embargo. And again, Trump just is threatening it now, right? And again, this is the whole thing. The United States has set up military installations. There's this first island chain, the second island chain. We've got missile troops all around there to interdict Chinese imports and exports. And so we're just waiting to pull the trigger on that. And
what about Taiwan? That's what I was.
That could be the flashpoint. The Philippines could be the flashpoint. This thing with Iran, where if Iran refuses to stop buying Iranian oil, if China refuses to stop buying Iranian oil, but we're going to see a buildup. Do you think that they're going to come to a deal with Iran?
That I don't know.
That's why you're here. You're here to answer that one question.
Well, all I know is that there's multiple competing influences in Trump's inner circle. That's sort of, he's actually a lot more savvy a politician than I think people give him credit for, because his sort of governing by chaos and unpredictability is really actually an effective strategy as far as his own political survival goes. But for example, the fact that I know that there was a story that Israel wanted to attack Iran, and Trump shot it down. And then, there's also, you see it on the flip side, this unprecedented level of influence where, in his cabinet, he has all these people who are, dominionist, people like Hegseth and the power of the Israeli lobby. And, but he also has appointed people who apparently were involved in convincing him to not go with the, not green light any kind of Israeli attack on Iran. I mean, I heard RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard were supposedly privy to that, and I don't know if that's true. This could just be gossip. But it just seems to me like it's very hard to tell in regard to.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you factor in the world economy. I mean, if that was not a factor, I wouldn't necessarily put it past, Trump to give Israel the go-ahead to go directly to war with Iran. But when you consider like the Iranian, the Strait of Hormuz, what the Houthis could do, the oil market, the other implications if a all-out war was to break out between Israel and Iran, there could be decisions made by certain countries that could crash the world economy, especially now with how closely tied. I mean, Iran and China have this 25-year economic partnership. It's very, there are many other factors at play, and those options have to be weighed before giving Israel the green light to. It's not just limited to what Israel wants to do and Israel's role as a beachhead in the Middle East. Like, there are much bigger factors that have a domestic consequences and global consequences. So it seems to me like Trump was hesitant to go ahead with that decision. And he might not be around very long. I mean, he might, I'm not even sure he's going to survive a whole term if like the economy really crashes or, it just seems like economically this country is really going downhill, and he, is already being made the fall guy for the defeat in Ukraine. He could be made the fall guy for like the economy going down the tubes. And he could be removed from office. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, what about? I think they're just. It's a matter of if. It's when and not if. It's when they're putting things in place before they crash the global economy. Trump is tasked with crashing the global economy, and when it happens, he's going to get support. Everybody's going to rally around him, right? Hey, all bets are off. We're not going to be partisan anymore. This is about our country. We are in a crisis. We've got to come together. And don't worry. We've negotiated all these trade deals with all these countries. We're a net energy exporter. We're going to be okay. But these are just crazy times that we had no control over. And so we're gonna be okay. And that way, because our economy is tanking. But right now we look at China. Oh, they're doing great. And so their whole spiel will be, well, everybody else is doing a lot worse than us. And right now they can't say that, but they really want to say that to the American people. They want to tell the American people, don't worry, everybody else is way, way worse. These are just crazy times. Anyway, that's the narrative that by 2027 you're going to see from CNN and Fox. I don't know.
Yeah, it's very hard. I don't know. I mean, that question, the Israel-Iran thing, I mean, in the previous episodes I've been on here, we kind of discussed it in like a existential sort of manner, like whether it would lead to nuclear war. But, the global economy might crash before that even scenario is even in the cards, like if this keeps up.
I think it would be intentional. Any attack on Iran, a serious attack by the United States or Israel, is an intentional destruction of the global economy. It means they're ready and they want it. That's it.
They
So-
certainly are not going to do something like that without considering all that, without anticipating.
Again, there's no way you're going to weaken China without destroying the global economy. Like, China is intrinsic to the global economy. So if you're going to contain China, weaken China, the global economy has to go down.
Well, you could. I
yeah.
mean, there's a lot of people that say that that's what COVID was about. I mean, that
a trial run, maybe.
Yeah, like, I mean, I don't necessarily ascribe to these theories. I'm just putting it out there. I mean, I personally, no matter what anyone thinks about COVID, like, which of course is the widest range of opinions you'll hear. Assuming one believes the whole biological attack narrative, regardless of what anyone thinks about how serious the whole virus was itself later on, I think initially there's some weird questions about how it originated, and then, like, whether it was something that backfired, that it was supposed to be some kind of, I mean, Ron Unz, for example, has written a lot of interesting articles about how it was like a biological attack on Russia, or on China and Iran, that like went astray and that, really backfired in the United States. I don't know. But either way, like, it just seems like, I mean, that what you were saying is a very interesting, plausible theory, actually. But yeah.
Well, I tell you each time you're on, and you make it sound like it's the first time you're hearing it from me.
No, I mean, you really should write more, man. Like, I think you should. Like, you have some spot on geopolitical analysis, like big picture stuff.
Yeah. We will see, and I hope I'm catastrophizing. I have written enough where I can definitely say I told you so, and believe me, I will pull them out and say, see, but it hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. It looks like it's getting closer and closer with each passing day, as we see events unfold. But Iran and China are two huge spots that are up in the air, and I think they're related. I think an attack on Iran is going to hurt the global economy, and that's when we're going to initiate our violently militarily imposed embargo of China and stop letting them have imports and exports through the seas. But listen to me now and believe me later.
Okay, well, if I come on in a month or two and the world economy has not crashed and we're not in the middle of a new Great Depression,
and Trump's tariff system works, and we're all
yeah,
rich.
and there's a factory opening here, and it's I mean it's clear that my opinion about the tariffs and all that is that it could have worked like 25 years ago maybe, but it's way too late. The U.S. has already been deindustrialized. It's just not. It just seems like it's going to drive the economy into the ground without the things that Christian Perenni was talking about.
Putin said we're about at least 15 years too late to even try and contain China. I don't know if you saw that quote, but I
mean, after COVID, no matter what things people think happened with COVID, China was already predicted to overtake the U.S. by the end of the decade, but now that process has been expedited because the U.S. economic recovery, it's like it's just, yeah. Here we go. The virus.
Look what you triggered, Max.
I know. You even mentioned that it's like these automatons just come out and have to.
I appreciate all perspectives. But that's one of them. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. The whole COVID thing, and I've stayed away from it just because it is very polarized.
You can't communicate with people about it because they already have their whatever their preconceived narrative is, and there's no discussion to be had because as soon as it's brought up, people just are like, it's like a pre-recording that you just hit play and they say whatever they're going to say. It doesn't matter. Like, regardless of what people think about COVID, whether it was real or not, the economic recovery, which is what we're talking about, the U.S. was already projected to not recover economically. I mean, its economic recovery, it has not really recovered at all. And China was already predicted to overtake the U.S. So,
and what the number one interest of the U.S. ruling class is not to improve the lives of the working class in the United States. They don't care about that. What they want to do is, cut China off at the knees and, make sure that the West maintains their obscenely disproportionate share of wealth, power, and privilege throughout the rest of the 21st century. That's goal number one. And so they're willing to again crash the global economy, cause pain domestically, but while they're causing that pain, their propaganda apparatus is going to overdrive, blaming China for the pain and saying, hey, don't worry, everybody else is hurting worse than we are here. But this is just a thing that we can't control. We got to just deal with it. Got to rally together as a nation. We'll see. Again, they don't have any real actual winning cards to play. So these are futile efforts, in my opinion, but efforts that they are going to nonetheless try. I hope I'm wrong. Simon says we can discuss COVID with him, which is good.
I'm not opposed to discussing it. It's just like whenever we're talking about something that's about something very like it's not in dispute that the U.S. economy was impacted by whatever went on. We're not talking about whether the virus was real or not.
Right.
Like, it's like we're talking about 9/11, and there are people, they just want to talk about whether there were actually planes or not, or whether it was fucking holograms, or whether there was actually, whether it was all planned to begin with. It's just like, there's something about COVID that just like, it's like people.
No, that's true. It is.
It's
polarizing, and people have real extreme views that are not really that flexible. I'm one of those. Like, I don't have real extreme views. I'm not certain still to this day exactly what happened, but I have some opinions. And I mean, of course, we were all affected by it. I know at my job place of public job place,
I mean,
it doesn't seem like it wasn't a real virus,
Well, I mean, like, I do security. Like, unlike most people, I actually had to fucking work the whole lockdown. So, like, I really don't want to be preached to by people about how, like, the whole thing was, as if you're not preaching to the choir, like, that I don't know the measures were ridiculous and things like that. Like, I had to fucking work and enforce all that shit. Like, I know. Like, yeah.
Well, you were a capo.
Yeah. It's just ridiculous. I'm not opposed to discussing it at all. And I'm not opposed to people getting into whether the whole virus was fake or not. My problem is like with the absolute certainty that people speak with about it, as if like with this self-appointed expertise, as if they know 1,000% what happened. Nobody knows what happened. That's the whole reason we're having this. Like, it's up for debate. If you just approach the argument with, I know 1,000% what happened, like a fucking robot automaton, it shuts down the discussion. Like, you have to listen to other people. And I just am so fucking sick of it. It's like, you don't know 1,000% what happened, and neither do I. Like, that's the whole thing. Like,
Carlo, do you know 1,000%? Oh, I muted you. Hold on. Because I was getting the feedback.
Yeah. 1,000%. Living I mean, Max lives in Baltimore. We can go to the now supposedly sanitized Fort Detrick, Maryland, and find the home of COVID. Yes, there's an interesting gentleman. I've lost his name, but he did a WETA documentary, and he was for many years. He was like in charge of the aerosol floated devised poisons, and they were doing this broadcast, and he said, "Look, this is what happens. You can see where I live. I live at a high elevation, looking down basically on whatever town he was above, one of the smaller towns. And he said, if I take the lid off this and throw it and cast it down into the air, that air will go down. If it's a poisonous gas, it will kill the people. There's a long history of the U.S. government testing all kinds of poisonous and quasi poisonous.
Well, that's what they say about
Whatever.
Lyme disease. That Lyme disease comes from, which was very prevalent in the DMV area, by the way. That Lyme disease may come from U.S. That its origins are in biological warfare experiments. But again, like when the conversation shifts to whether it existed or not at all, there is no conversation. Like it's basically like, okay, well, you've decided that it doesn't exist at all, so therefore, what is there to discuss?
Right.
It's like you don't know that for 100% for certain. The degree to which it was exaggerated is clearly debatable.
We appreciate each of our 10 viewers. Wendy, that includes you. So no, I appreciate you guys watching, and your opinions are welcome, and I'm open to things. And I like to disagree too. So, but yeah, nobody take offense if we're disagreeing with you. But we appreciate anybody who watches this. But Max, we're gonna have you back for part 2, I hope, of your article. And like I said, in the comments below of the YouTube video is a link to Max's article, a link to his discussion with Jeremy and Gloria. It was a great discussion. But yeah, we got to wrap it up. My blood sugar is very low. Carlo, thanks for hanging in there. I hope to see you next Tuesday as well. But I know if you're not feeling well, yeah, don't kill yourself to join us. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
and I hope I didn't offend anybody with how animated I got. It's very the COVID discussion just gets very frustrating because it feels like people, yes, I have my preconceived narrative. I happen to think that it started out as something real, and then it became, as it spread, it became less deadly, but then was used as an excuse to, initiate these controversial policies, these lockdown policies, which were horrible.
And quantitative easing. You gotta save. You gotta pump money into the economy.
Yeah,
Keep it.
But when we have a discussion about whether it even existed or not in the first place, I just don't know how you even approach a discussion like that. Like, I am not any kind of expert on viruses, and I can listen to varying opinions, but I don't know how to determine something like that. It just seems like that shuts down the whole discussion. You don't even have to go there whether or not you agreed with the lockdown measures or not. Supposedly I had COVID. It didn't seem particularly threatening to me, but that's, that was like I supposedly got the variant.
Positive.
I don't know. So I guess, maybe it was I know that the tests were notoriously unreliable. Maybe it was just a regular flu. I don't know. I am not a fucking viral expert on any of this stuff, but I don't know. It just seems like the COVID discussion, it's like impossible to have. It's impossible to have because people just come into it with this. They have their narrative, and it's like it's been very frustrating to even get into that subject. It just seems like it's like, the whatever it's, I don't know. It's very frustrating. So, but I didn't mean to offend anybody. It's just,
No, on that last frustrating word, we're gonna wrap it up because my blood sugar is even lower than it was 5 minutes ago. Max, you get the last word. We will probably not be having a program all about the C word. I don't know if YouTube's still banning that or not, but yeah.
And actually, yeah, that's another thing. I wrote an article for Medium, or that was my Medium account was taken down because I wrote an article talking about how it was a biological attack. So if there wasn't a virus at all, I mean, it's kind of hard. You know, when I literally lost my Medium account for even raising that possibility, you know, it's like if I don't see people, I mean, I don't know. Had I written an article saying there was no virus at all, would my account have been taken down? I don't know. But
Ron Unz makes a strong argument. I mean, I've read a lot of his stuff on COVID about, wasn't it the military Olympics? They might have brought it over there.
Yes, and the fact that it was very strange the way that all these high-ranking Iranian officials got the virus. Yes, there was the whole tabletop role-playing conference, and yes, I know it's become, it's become in vogue now to say that because the CIA is now admitting it had some kind of lab origins. I don't necessarily agree with the lab leak theory. I don't know.
Right.
It seems to me like it was more like some sort of attack that went awry. But again, like if the virus itself wasn't even real, there's no point in even having the discussion. It's like, what is there to talk about? The whole thing was this fictitious narrative to impose these lockdown measures. I mean,
thanks for alienating half my viewers, Max. I'm gonna go. Okay, no, thank you, everybody. We will see you next week, Tuesday. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Thanks.